Hello, everybody. This is Aaron, and welcome back to the show. I have another very special guest today, and that is Matt Hennessey. Matt is the deputy op-ed editor of the Wall Street Journal editorial page. So he's the one that's rejected all of the op-eds I've submitted there over the years. He's also my former colleague at the Manhattan Institute, where we sat right next to each other, where he was an editor on the City Journal team. And way back in a previous career, you were an actor, which is, I don't actually know a huge amount about that part of your life, but you're very creative, both acting, writing over the years, now editing. And you are, and very importantly, Matt, the author of 0 Hour for Gen X, which is a book that came out maybe, 5 years ago now?
4 years. It's almost 4 years old.
Right. Can you hold that up to the camera so people can see that? There should be a link to buy it in the show notes. So it's something you'd want to check out. I just thought we'd have a...
This is the paperback edition, which actually came out, I want to say 2020, but
Okay.
I could be wrong about that.
Okay, well, great. Well, I thought we would just use the book as a launching point to talk about all things Generation X. Because I'm Generation X, you are Generation X. How do you define Generation X?
Well, I think that the standard definition that most people would use would be people born between roughly 1965 and 1980. That works for me. I think that's the definition that I use in the book. Occasionally I try to think up easier ways to sort of categorize people, because you'll get an awful lot of people saying, well, I don't know exactly what I am because I was born in 1982 and I feel a lot of kinship with the whole Gen X worldview, but I think I'm a millennial. So what am I? And my shorthand is that if you remember the moon landing, you're probably a baby boomer, not Gen X. And if Google helped you get through high school, you're definitely a millennial, not Gen X. So it's bookended sort of by anyone who really remembers the 60s is not Gen X. You might have some childhood snippet of a memory or something like that. But if you really remember Woodstock happening or Sergeant Pepper's or something like that, then you're definitely too old for Gen X. And, a lot of millennials will say, I do remember a time when there was no internet. That's what they'll sort of profess to me, and I don't think that they're being honest. I don't think they know what they're talking about. I don't think they know really what the internet was in its earliest form, and by that I mean its earliest consumer form. So the kind of things that people who are not tech wizards or early adopters or super nerd geniuses used the internet for in like 1995 or 1996. And it really stayed that way until about 2001 or 2002. So a lot of these millennials who say, oh, no, man, I remember what life was like before the internet. They really don't. They really don't.
The standard years that you gave, 65 to 80, made me think, man, the baby boomers were from 46 to 64. They get 20 years and we only have 15 years. I mean, so just right off the bat, we started out getting screwed. Isn't that basically the story of Generation X?
Well, I think you might be looking at it from the wrong angle. These things are often, decided after the fact. So they're sort of overlays. People look at rates of birth and certain characteristics as we got older. Nobody called us Generation X in 1985, right? Nobody rang the bell in 1964 or 65 and said, all right, that's it, baby boom's over. It was something that was only, you could only see in hindsight. So a lot of the characteristics that we associate with baby boomers and the characteristics we associate with Gen X or millennials, all of this stuff is a work in progress. You couldn't say we got gypped because nobody knew what was going on. And these are rear view mirror calculations. Yeah, the baby boom. If you can see graphs, you can find them of the number of live births by year in the United States, and it just goes off the cliff in the middle of the 60s, and that's the end of the baby boom. and what comes next is us. And there's a lot of reasons for it. There's a natural pendulum to these kinds of things. Large generations have a lot of kids, small generations don't, so it swings back and forth. And obviously the introduction of the pill, a lot of changing mores around family life, women in the workforce, all that jazz sort of combined to bring the baby boom to an end. Yeah, so a lot of this stuff is not doesn't happen in real time. You know, you don't have people sort of. Well, you actually, if you think about it, there's a lot of discussion all the time about, well, what do we call these kids? Who is this new generation? These Zoomers or Gen Z? What comes next? So we've gotten into the habit now of trying to christen or name youngsters before they're really ready for a name, before they've done anything to warrant these kinds of blanket descriptions that we like to give. There's a lot of people who will fight you about all of it. Will say it's all bogus, none of it exists, it's all made up, and it's totally true. It's all made up, but it's useful and it's fun.
Yeah, I say it's useful as a heuristic. What you talked about in terms of the collapsing birth rates, I do think really gets at something. I think it was originally called the baby bust, maybe generation, in that Generation X is numerically much smaller than the baby boomers and also much smaller than the millennial generation. The millennials actually are a bigger generation than the baby boomers. Now, that's not entirely fair because America was a more populous country. So probably as a share of the total population, the millennials have represented not as large a generation as the boomers did kind of in their peak. But we are a small generation sandwiched between two very large generations, and therefore have spent much of our lives operating in the shadows of the baby boomers. And that has left us a little bit at risk of missing some of our turn, if you will, in some aspects of life, which I think was really some of what you were getting at in your book. That was the gist. That was
the big idea, or what I thought was the big idea back in 2015 when you and I were sitting in an office next to each other, and I had this idea, which, with the passage of time, maybe doesn't seem like the most original idea, but it was a little fresher then, that there are these two gigantic ostrich eggs passing through the snake in the form of the millennials and the baby boomers and the millennials, and in between it's this sort of I don't want to mix my metaphors here, but this valley, between the two peaks of these giant generations. And it really, we felt it as teenagers. It's undeniable that the cultural stew that we were swimming in when we were teenagers and young adults was thoroughly influenced by the baby boom. In a lot of ways, the baby boom never stopped until about 1993 or 4. All of the movies and pop culture references of the 80s.
It was all about Vietnam. So much Vietnam stuff. Born in the USA.
I know more about Vietnam than some of the people who lived through it. By virtue of all those movies, it's just like every other movie. So the baby boomers were really working out a lot of stuff in public when we were kids, and we absorbed a lot of it to the point where sometimes it felt like we didn't have our own soundtrack. I think eventually we did, and that's why we have. That's why people call us a discrete thing. That's why people refer to us as a generation. So all is not lost, but there's definitely a sense of somebody once called us the neglected kid brother of the baby boomers. Just a sort of something that just doesn't get talked about, and then here come the millennials just crashing like a wave. And saying, well, it's our turn now. And before you know it, it's like, the torch has been passed right over our heads.
Right. Well, the baby boomers got very senior positions in society comparatively early in life. Like, they took over American institutions starting in the 80s and the 90s, and they basically never let go of them. So there's a Presbyterian news kind of biweekly called World Magazine that there's just been a lot of controversy about, and one of their columnists resigned there, Mindy Bells, and she's very unhappy about that. And I looked up Mindy Bells. She started working at that magazine in 1986. So she's been like a personage there since I was a sophomore in high school. And you could tell that her and the editor who left sort of felt like it was their thing and that nobody else should really have a say in how it should be run. You know, Bill Clinton was the first boomer president in 1992. And, Clinton and Trump were all born the same year, 1946. Hillary was born in 47. And to the extent that there are any people who are in power today who aren't boomers, it's like pre-boomers, like Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi, who, from a cultural perspective, I kind of view a lot of the people born during World War II as sort of culturally boomer. I put like Newt Gingrich, and a lot of those guys are born in 42. I always say that the heartland of boomerdom is the 1942 to 1954 birth years. I think the second half of the boomer generation probably feels a little lost themselves. They were more children of the 70s than the 60s. But I think the key is, these boomers are still running everything. There's all these charts about, the average age of a CEO over the last 15 years has conveniently gone up by 15 years. And so in essence, there haven't been as many. Peter Thiel talks about this in his interviews. And one reason he left Big Law is because he sensed when he went to work there that the ladder was being pulled up behind the boomers, and he was never going to get it as good. I was not as smart as he was. I didn't detect this as early, but when I worked at Accenture, which was then called Anderson Consulting, that's exactly what happened. The ladder got pulled up behind the baby boomers, and you even saw that at the point that once the last baby boomer made full partner, they IPO'd the company and took all the future money off the table too. And so there's never been a Gen X president to date. There may never be a Gen X president, to be honest. I think in pretty much institutionally, Generation X has largely been bypassed. And if some of these people don't step up now, maybe there won't ever be a chance.
Yeah, I like this. You've done a lot of thinking about it. It's almost like you have a more mature taxonomy of the whole issue than I do.
I spent a lot of time thinking about baby boomers. I can tell you that. Too much.
So we work ourselves into a little bit of a pickle here because we're supposed to be the generation that doesn't care, that is very insouciant and sort of unconcerned with career or achievement or what anybody else is doing. We're live and let live. We've sort of like learned how to take a few lumps and not run home to our mommy, asking her to solve all of our problems. But yet, I've run into this as a sort of professional Gen X guy out here hawking books on the subject and presenting myself as some kind of an expert, where people say, well, if you really are like all those things, if those are really characteristics that you point to as defining you, what's your problem? Just let these things happen. They're natural. Nobody planned the baby boom. Nobody planned this giant millennial generation. It's all just happening. So why don't you just play the type and say whatever, never mind. Just live your life. And I'm very much inclined to do that. But it's notable. Like we're allowed to, I think, to point these things out that in our workplaces, not in all of our workplaces, but in many of our workplaces, the dynamic that you just described is on full display. There's a generation that is just sort of like aging in place in the upper echelons of management in lots of different industries, right? And the generation that's, or the strata that's just sort of been waiting its turn, playing by the rules, doing what it's supposed to do, aging into their late 40s and their early 50s, and just sort of like tapping their fingers on the desk saying, well, any day now, it'll be me. And when you look over your shoulder, there's just like hordes of 30-year-olds coming down the step like a Mongol horde, like raping and pillaging and taking whatever they want and screaming and stomping their feet if they're not promoted yesterday. So we've all seen it. It's just sort of it's not the kind of thing that you could develop some kind of a quantitative measure to put into a spreadsheet. But it's just a vibe that you get that like the music's going to stop here in a minute, and there ain't going to be any chairs for us. You know what I mean? Like there's not going to be a place at the table. Now the president thing is useful or is sort of enjoyable game to play, because if you just look across the landscape of viable or political actors that are getting a lot of press, and there's not a single one of them that really seems likely to be able to break through in that very top level. You got a whole raft of senators who are in their 40s, mid 40s. A bunch of them just tried to run in 2020 as Democrats and totally flamed out. One of them survived for reasons that are really increasingly unclear, and she seems totally incapable of ever ascending to that top job. It seems impossible, barring something awful happening to the current White House. So if anybody has a great theory about a Gen Xer who's in line to be president, I'm all ears.
Right. Well, it kind of depends on how you do it. Ron DeSantis is 43, so he would probably count as Generation X. He might be the last of Generation X.
I think he's definitely a Generation X.
Yeah. So there may be some guys like that, but you're right. Paul Ryan.
But he's got to go. He's got a baby boomer who won't let go, who's going to make his life miserable. So
yeah, you got the big poster child for Gen X politicians was Paul Ryan. I'm like, please no. Yeah. I do think part of the challenge with Generation X, I do think there were some external factors, but I think we have to take some responsibility in that we essentially made peace with this living in the shadows of the boomers part of the world. This is a generation that, unlike boomers, like say Donald Trump, I think typifies boomers in a lot of ways, or the stereotype of a millennial, which are very, very self-assertive, very, very, very pushing to get what they want. The stereotype of Generation X is more detached. It's what we're doing here. It's step back, be analytical, think about the world, but far less about promoting our own cause. I think the boomers were much, much more pushing. And again, it wasn't entirely just a factor of how hard they pushed. They had a lot of external things working in their favor. But I do think Generation X has sort of many years ago made peace with its place in the world in some ways.
Yeah, when you were just saying that, I was reminded that, and I really don't know where this impulse comes from, but when I was, a teenager or in my early 20s, I remember that one of the worst things you could say about a musician or an actor or even somebody that you knew was that they were a sellout. This was everywhere. Like it was the top diss of 1989. Like that guy's a sellout. I don't get the sense that anybody else would hold it, that anyone would hold it against you for selling out anymore. The question of greater moment would be what's holding you up? Why haven't you sold out? So there was something very unusual about us in that regard that we, you said not very self-promotional. I think that's true. Of course, you could come up with exceptions. There would be all sorts of people who have done very well in the arts and in business and all these other fields by promoting the hell out of themselves. But that notion of a sellout, someone who's only in it for the money, or who is willing to sort of, substance isn't as important as image, like that used to be a big deal. I just don't get the sense that anyone under the age of 40 really speaks that language anymore. Maybe they do. I'm sure somebody would like to punch
I can't wait to get my corporate sponsorships for my Instagram influencer account. sort of thing, or become a YouTube star or something like that.
Yeah.
It does seem like becoming a star is a big thing that young people aspire to today. They may not use the term star, but
well, maybe we can mark the beginning of the end with the sort of the reality television boom, that whole business of Paris Hilton, or these older millennials, right?
Mm-hmm.
What are geriatric millennials is the new catchphrase, that were sort of famous for being famous, that sort of figured out this new media landscape, what we used to call new media, reality television, and early forms of social media, that really just sort of cracked the code right away of how to monetize the image, and just sort of make money by being yourself and eating your lunch and looking fabulous. I mean, all of that stuff is like, would have made the guys that made Seattle famous, right. Want to smash stuff.
Right. I think this idea of 0 hour for Generation X is very relevant today, because I do think that Generation X has been playing a very important role in the world since your book came out. And it's not in terms of taking the lead in organizations, but it has been in terms of intellectual and social disruption. If you look especially at a lot of the online sort of influencers in a lot of spaces, a lot of them are either Generation X or they are younger millennials. So let me give you a couple examples of who I'm talking about. Joe Rogan is Generation X. Peter Thiel is Generation X. Many of the Claremont Institute people are Generation X. Matt Peterson is Generation X. James Poulos is Generation X. Ryan Williams is probably technically a millennial, I think, if you use the cutoff date, but he's right in there with Generation X, I think very early 80s birthday. Seth Barron, our former colleague, is Generation X. So that whole kind of axis of disruptors there. Again, Peter Thiel, Generation X. Mike Cernovich, the internet influencer, if you know Mike Cernovich, he's Generation X. Curtis Yarvin, the political guy they called Mencius Moldbug, that was so big in launching this kind of dissident political theory movement, was Generation X. If you look at a lot of the controversial characters out there in the world that seem to be focused on disrupting intellectual, social, and political landscape, it seems to me that a lot of that is being done by Generation X. I think even Jordan Peterson is a late boomer, but he's not in that early boomer heartland. What do you think of that thesis?
Well, that's fine. I mean, I'm sure that somebody who wanted to prove you wrong would be able to produce a list of a bunch of lefty podcasters and Washington Post reporters and CNN anchors who cut the other way. But
well, they might be. Yeah, there might be. Like I would guess probably some of them are.
One of the
how old is Glenn? Is Glenn Greenwald a millennial, or is he Generation X?
I don't know. He looks like a Generation X.
He looks like a Generation X guy. I haven't looked him up. So
he might be.
My apologies to Glenn Greenwald if he's.
I thought what was going to distinguish us in the long run was that we would be the last generation that remembered what it was like to grow up without the internet. I thought that was a real dividing line between us and every generation that's coming after. We would be the last ones to remember what it was like to live in a world of disconnected peace and quiet, of not being able to reach people that you needed to reach, having to wait for satisfaction, and to not be able to have the world instantly at your fingertips, and all of the ways we've had to adjust the way we live to accommodate for this reality. I thought that was going to be the standard that Gen X bore into the next 40 years until we died off and everybody just went on without us. I didn't realize that we would be the last generation that remembered free speech, that remembered what many of the most foundational civil liberties that every single person in my high school class would have told you was like completely non-negotiable. And they would have, honestly, many of them would have accepted that case or made that case with a sort of a lefty slant in their mind, that we need to protect free speech because the big bad corporation and the big bad government are coming out here trying to stomp, Woodstock 93's a message of peace and love or whatever. The fact that we find ourselves now saying, hey, hold on a second, wait a minute. Free speech is important. We need to defend it even when we don't like it, or perhaps most importantly, when we don't like it, we need to defend it. And that we're being called the worst names possible because of this was not something that I ever expected was going to be the stamp that we left on the world. Yeah. So that's really been fascinating to see in the last 5 years, because when I wrote the book, that was not the idea that I had in mind, although the book does touch on some of that. At the time that I wrote the book, some of the controversies that were raging had to do with comedians going on to campuses and saying, I'm not going to play colleges anymore. I mean, now we sort of like understand instinctively why that would be. Like, that'd be a crazy place for a comedian to go and try to make jokes, edgy jokes. But 5 years ago, it was still something that people were scratching their heads about. Like, what are these kids got no sense of humor? I mean, what's the problem with these kids? So, the rapid deterioration in the respect for this kind of essential American attribute really has taken me by surprise. And so, I'm not surprised, actually, now that we've been talking about it and thinking of it, that, I think the boomers are just tired, right, of these fights and these wars. And they've, as you said, they've climbed the mountain. They're happy with their position, and they're going to eventually fade from the scene. It's inevitable that they're not going to stick around forever. But I don't see a whole lot of appetite for fighting these kind of fights. There's a sense of, and I think it comes with age, maybe, older than we are now, people, you've probably seen it in your own family where it's just too much. It's too confusing. I don't even know what's going on. I don't even know what you guys are arguing about. So I'll just leave it to you, which really means they're leaving it to us, the last adult generation, if I might.
Well, as you see, again, I think a lot of these journalists who are sort of involved in that, a lot of them are Gen X. So Glenn Greenwald, I looked him up while you're talking. Glenn Greenwald is Generation X. That Matt Taibbi or however you're going to say his name is Generation X. Jonathan Chait is Generation X. Rod Dreher is Generation X. And these are just very different people than, say, the more iconoclastic millennial pundits, if you want to call them that, tend to be very technocratic, like Matthew Iglesias and Ezra Klein. They just have a very different style. And, so I do think that Generation X is fully engaged today in a way that it was not before. And I think free speech is one. So I think there are a few things that I say. I do think this last analog generation concept is an important one. I think the last free speech generation is also a very interesting one. We were also the last free-range kids. We were the last kids that actually had freedom in childhood. In fact, that is when Strauss and Howe wrote the book Generations, the way that the children were raised and treated was the primary demarcation point that he used to delineate between millennials and Generation X, and that millennials were the baby on board generation, helicopter parenting, all of that. They've lived their life in a safer space. They've never had the freedom, and ergo, they expect things to be in a safer space. I think free speech is one where, Generation X is very engaged. Not all the free speech, advocate types are in that, but it does seem like Generation X is much more involved in these battles than they used to be. Again, if you go back to Strauss and Howe's book from 1992, which I don't know if you read, Generations, they sort of viewed Generation X as a reprise of the lost generation from the World War I generation, basically viewing that generation as one that essentially, died in poverty, didn't really have a very good life, although they were kind of the jazz age and some of that. It was really the following generations that really prospered. And there's basically, it's like, the gist of it is Generation X has to fall on a grenade to take down the baby boomers before they destroy the country so that the millennials can build a new future. They saw the millennials as the next greatest generation, which I actually see them much more as a reincarnation of the boomers, to be quite honest.
It was written in 92, though.
This was written in 92.
Yeah, so
but I do think this role of like Generation X a little bit as a disruptor that clears some space for people in subsequent generations to potentially build a healthier culture. And that doesn't mean that they will necessarily do that. Every generation has to win it anew, in essence. So the millennials and Generation X are going to have to stand on their own 2 feet. They can't just rest on the inheritance that they received, but at least we can try to make sure that they have some inheritance to preserve or build on. In free speech, I think, is a very big one on that.
Well, I'm actually much more pessimistic than you are about what's possible. You're probably right. We do probably have to have this fight. We do have to fall on the grenade. It has to be done. It's like our destiny, but I have no idea. I have very little confidence that it's going to preserve anything worth preserving. Mm-hmm. In part because it's such an unfair fight. There are so many of them, and so few of us. I was thinking a lot of people were talking about the Super Bowl halftime show this weekend, mm-hmm. which was a bunch of rap stars from the 90s. And in the context of free speech and freedom of expression and not selling out, there was a lot to chew on in that. I don't know if you saw it. You're asking me if I've read books, but I'll ask you if you saw the Super Bowl.
No, I didn't watch the Super Bowl.
All right. In this battle about free speech, what you can say, what's misinformation, what's obscene, what is harmful. I can't help but think that, a lot of people have pointed to the PMRC hearings in 85 and 86 that had to do with heavy metal, right? A lot of what were considered to be were like over-the-line lyrics in heavy metal that needed to be dealt with. And
Tipper Gore, the Parents Music Resource Center, is what he's talking about.
Yeah, and so what ended up happening was a lot of artists went down to D.C. and made passionate speeches in favor of letting artists do what they have to do and their constitutional right to say what they wanted to say. A couple of years after that, there was a mini controversy having to do with some rap lyrics, which, to be honest, are far more potent often than anything you'll find would have found in heavy metal of 1985. But everybody played their part in that dispute too. The guy named Luther Campbell, Two Live Crew. Do you remember that?
Oh yeah. I remember that.
Really,
I think I own that album. Actually.
Yeah, right. Nice. Obscene, just sort of like, as my father would say, very little redeeming social value. But it became a cause celeb. It's like, this is free speech. You're allowed to be dumb. You're allowed to say stupid stuff. You're allowed to say wrong stuff. Everybody has the right to be wrong. You don't get to shut people up just because it doesn't strike you as right. That's the price of liberty. That's what freedom means. All of this was just baseline stuff. So here, the 90s the Super Bowl. Where are all these people in that fight now? Where is Dr. Dre and Eminem in the current wars over who's allowed to say what? Mm-hmm. I'm really surprised that some of these guys haven't. Maybe they see the writing on the wall and they don't see any value in fighting this fight. People like Howard Stern. I mean, is there another?
Well, Howard Stern has become a pathetic.
Well, he's probably benefited from the First Amendment more than any living human, and he's just such a such a waste. Well, I think
he's trying to save his own skin, perhaps, from people watching some of his listening to some of his old episodes and canceling him post haste.
He's trying to get out in front of it, but I don't know. I've just been very disappointed. We were worried about. These guys were all worried about being sellouts, but when the chips are on the table, they're just not showing up. This is my new crusade. Where are the rappers? Mm-hmm. Why have they all gone silent?
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of talk today about technology and its effect on children, and especially Generation Z, that was raised entirely in the smartphone world. And there's all this talk about the kids these days are suffering from mental illness. They're suffering from all these problems. Teenage girls are suicidal because not everybody's liking their Instagram posts. That there's all this manipulation of especially young people with these algorithms, and that we've completely detached from reality and from the physical world in an unhealthy way. And now we're hearing about the metaverse as well, where people will just retreat, I guess, into a virtual reality world. That was a big preoccupation of your book. Keeping faith with the real world, or something like that, was how you discussed it. How do you feel about that today? Is there anything to be done about it, this digital immersion that we have, or is that one that's impossible? This is one that I think is a little difficult.
It is. How do I'm of two minds about it today. On the one hand, I still very much believe and endorse everything that I wrote. The last few years, I'm happy to say, I have seen people begin to, let's just say, self-regulate, right? We're all still addicted to our phones. We're all still addicted to social media. It's true. And that's probably not going to change because we're not strong enough, I don't think, to walk away. But I do think that people have started to sort of see, like, the powerful Oz, the man behind the curtain, is very actively manipulating them. So I think that all of the ways that we better understand how these ecosystems work to control us, to direct our behavior, to learn about us, to feed us advertising, to monetize our scrolling habits. Like, we're all we're hipper to that now than we used to be, and that's all good. And I think that it's led a lot of people to make marginal choices in their approach to technology that redounds to the good. I know in my own life, I'm much more, to use a buzzy word, I'm much more mindful about my technology use. I have children, so I'm very on top of what they're allowed to use, how they interact with it. I had been hoping that, you got to remember, this stuff is all very, very new still. Facebook, Twitter, the iPhone. The iPhone is like a little bit more than 10 years old. Facebook, 15 years, 16 years, something like that. It's very possible that in 20 years, we'll look back on this period of the 2010s and say, wow, we all really lost our minds there for a little while with this when this new stuff started rolling in, and we forgot how to act, and it took us a while to adjust, to incorporate it, to see what was good about it, to reject what was bad about it, and hopefully in 5 or 10 years we'll all be able to, we'll look back on this and it'll seem funny. So that's the one side of it. That's my thinking about what I wrote in the book. Of course, the pandemic was a curveball that nobody was expecting. It's a knuckleball, really, bounce all around in ways that you can't predict. So one of the things that who could have predicted that this technology allowed us to retreat to our home studios and can keep the broadcast going. That's also good and bad, right? For all we know, it prolonged the misery. Everyone, well, a lot of people got very comfortable in their little habit holes and don't want to come out. So that's something to be reckoned with. On the other hand, at least in the early stages of the pandemic, it seemed like it's kind of a lifeline. I mean, we got to remember nobody had any idea what was happening, and there was a real panic and real fear that you were going to get sick and die by the end of the week. So everybody wanted to go home, and this allowed certain corners of the economy, the knowledge economy, to keep on trucking. Without it, I don't know what we would have done. Fully apart from the economic side of things, the technology is kind of miraculous. It allowed me to stay in touch with my dad as he was on his deathbed. I wouldn't have been able to visit him. He was in the hospital. He didn't have COVID, but he was in the hospital and he was dying, and I was not able to visit him. FaceTime and all these kind of like technologies enabled it. And that's just one example from one guy's life that was, things could have been a lot worse for us emotionally if that wasn't available. So I'm not willing to say that all of this technology is 1,000% evil. There's certainly good to be derived from it, and I enjoy a lot of it in my own life. Having said that, I'm always suspicious of people who are double thumbs up all the time. I think we call them extremely online people, or there's probably even a more current term for it that I'm not up on. So those are my thoughts on where we stand post-pandemic, or quasi post-pandemic, with regard to technology. There's no putting the horse back in the barn. It's never going to happen. I never was suggesting that it should happen. But my great hope, my great prayer for the world is that every person will get their sanity back, whatever sanity was taken from them by Twitter or Instagram or whatever madness was allowed to come into their home. And God bless the people who managed to keep it away entirely. That's probably altogether a better way to live.
Yeah, I agree with you that I think there will be a correction to some of the digital immersion, especially of children. I make the analogy to the divorce revolution and the 70s latchkey kids. And there was this theory, people will get divorced. It'll be better for the kids if the parents aren't fighting. And then realized, wait a minute, after 10 years of that, it's really not good for these kids to be left home alone after school or whatever. And in the 80s, there was kind of this correction of baby on board. It did not mean that we got rid of the divorce revolution, but there was some response to try to create new norms around that. And we already see it happening with technology. The tech titans themselves do not allow their own children to have access to social media technology. Orrin Cass, our former colleague at the Manhattan Institute, made a quip in response to an article about all the tech companies buying up and so much office space. They've been signing all these leases. It's like they're promising you a completely virtual world where no one has to go to the office, even as they prepare to expand their office footprint to create products that they won't even allow their own kids to use. It's like they themselves operate by a completely different standard. I actually think the impact of technology on the pandemic was probably a negative in the sense that in the absence of this technology, these extended lockdowns and things that had been very harmful to children, virtual school, you wouldn't be able to have this illusion that virtual school was a viable option. And I do think that some of the negative effects of the pandemic were a result of our access to this technology, which lets us do other things. And it goes in with the free speech issues as well. Surveillance tech, like what's going on in China, the technology is very bad on a lot of fronts. But again, I wouldn't be talking to you today if not for technology. So I would be completely frozen out of the public conversation because of the gatekeeping that used to be in the old world. So there is a sort of good and bad at it. The thing that I found most interesting about millennials and technology was something that I heard from Morley Winograd. He's a writer who's an expert on millennials. He's written many books about millennials. I think he himself is a baby boomer. And he made this point that I had never considered, which is that millennials don't actually know about technology and how it works. They're very good users of technology. They're very good at using their phone, using a computer. They don't know how it works. Whereas Gen X people built their own homebrew computers. They basically knew way more about how technology functioned than millennials. And I thought that was an interesting one, that these generations are not necessarily as tech savvy as we might think because they've got these screens and they're just using it, but they don't really understand it. And it gets to a point with them, I think, that you said the distinction between these technologies today and the old technologies like TV is that the old technologies you used, the new technologies use you. It's a very different relationship.
Yeah, but I mean, it's a relationship that I think that most of us, I mean, nobody is going to sit here now in 2022 and say, really? That's what they're doing? You know? I mean, just the other day, my wife showed me something on her phone that, we were both certain was something we had only said to each other. And there it is, it pops up as an ad or some kind of search suggestion.
Well, that happens all the time.
Everyone has had this experience. Every single tech company says there's no way that that's possible.
But it happens because we have the same thing at my house.
Yeah, well, we all know that it's happening. So my point is that we know that it's happening now, and that's good. You think that, or I don't know, this fellow that you were summarizing says that millennials don't know how it works. I think they don't care how it works. Mm-hmm. I think there's a sort of utility there that they just don't want to question. This is so good. And so it's the old David Foster Wallace thing. This is water. It's just the water that I swim in. Why would I question it? Why would I give a crap how it works? It works so good, and it makes everything go. Like, I have to like my friend's post. I have to see where my classmates went last night. I have to post sexy bikini shots or whatever. What are you even talking about? How does it work? Mm-hmm. I definitely think that I definitely think that in my experience, I don't want to make it sound like I'm, creeping around, like trying to interview millennials without them realizing it. In my experience, and I've known many wonderful patriotic millennials who don't fit this description at all, but the most of them are completely unconcerned with security. I'm sure they don't want people reading their emails, but privacy just is not high on the list of concerns. Like, why would anybody want to look at my text messages? Like, what? I mean, you should know better now after years and years of people getting canceled for dopey things that they thought were private conversations. But nobody thinks that spotlight's going to turn on them. So yeah, my strong view is that millennials just don't care. And the sense is that there's, We used to have the, horse and buggy, and then we had the car. We used to have the telegram or the telegraph, and then we had the phone. So now we have the TikTok and Tinder and stuff. I don't even know what it is. Shut up, old man. If you don't like it, you can leave. My point, or the point I tried to make in the book, is that these are not simple tools like the telegraph. The telegraph wasn't, storing your message somewhere and
it wasn't recording everything you said 24 hours. Right.
Western Union didn't have a dossier on all of us. So there's a fundamental difference there, a fundamental technological difference. But the technology has a personality, and the technology has. I'm a big fan of Neil Postman, who's the sort of intellectual era.
Amusing Ourselves to Death. Great book.
Who he didn't live to see this stuff, but he saw it coming. And his great preoccupation was with television and these kind of passive entertainments. Just sort of like, this couch potato idea where you just sit and content washes over you and your brain melts and you disappear into the couch. And he could very clearly see that was not going to be good for us. As I point out in the book, in a weird way, television before the DVR required a little bit of discipline, in the sense you had to be there on time to see your show, or else you missed it and you were just flat out of luck, unless you happened to be like really on top of the TV guide and knew that it was going to replay on Thursday night at 10:30. You might be able to see it a second time, but there was a sort of an element of you blink and you miss it. In the current environment, all of the tools are totally different, not passive at all. They are working on us. They are collecting data from us rather than us collecting data from the TV guide. It's a fundamental reversal of the relationship, and Postman saw it coming very, very presciently. It's really remarkable to go back and read that book now, because he's like the Nostradamus of the internet age. Somehow he had all the secrets before the story was written.
He said that these technologies change everything into show business, and I never stop thinking about that line when I think of Donald Trump, that everything is show business. And so we shouldn't be surprised when we see show business people. I guess Ronald Reagan was a good example of that. We see show business people entering into other domains.
We see show business people entering other domains, but we also see that everybody's in show business now.
Right. Everybody.
This is Yuval Levin's great contribution to the argument, which is that, that sounds patronizing, that he's having a great contribution. It's a very astute observation, which is that he's speaking mostly about younger people, millennials, the internet age, people who grew up in this environment with these tools, who no longer see any value in being part of an institution. The institution is just a platform. Where have we heard that word before? It's just a platform for you to build your own brand. And so what matters more than anything is the name down on the corner of the screen, that everybody, likes and subscribes to your channel, and you build it out that way. And if you get too big for the New York Times or Spotify or whatever it is, you just bounce. And you build, you just protect your sort of core, your core brand and your core identity, and the institution be damned. That's going to have a lot of negative effects on society in the long run. We're only sort of seeing the first breaking waves of that.
I got
pebble in the pond.
Coming up on the top of the hour here, and I'll get time for one more question. And one thing about your book that, looking at it a few years later, does not seem to ring as true was the example you used of the record store and people today with digital music not getting the record store experience, browsing, all of that. It's interesting that we have seen this tremendous comeback of vinyl, and that millennials seem to love, yes, they have all the digital music, but they seem to love the vinyl records. And in fact, in my neighborhood, there's like bigger record stores here now than there really ever were before. And so many people have gotten into vinyl. Does this reaching out for sort of retro analog experiences, whether it be vinyl records or baking your own bread at home or all the things that people do, what does that tell us about what's going on in our relationship to the digital and the analog today?
I don't know. I mean, for one thing, I'm not entirely sure I believe you or that I agree that the world is mad for vinyl. I know that there are people who love it and who really love it, and there's enough of a economy there to support stores, physical brick and mortar stores that will sell records in a big city. I would love to have a record player around here so I could play some records. But I'm a little too busy living my real life to give up these wonderful digital goodies and orient it in that way. Having said that, I did recommend in the book that if you want to get a taste of or maintain some connection to the analog world, this wouldn't be the worst idea to subscribe to some magazines and some newspapers and maybe get a record player. I actually have a typewriter in my house, a manual typewriter that's sadly needs some repairs, but it gives me great pleasure. Having said that, it's like I hear myself saying it and it really sounds dumb. I mean, like, don't you know, haven't you ever met or been in a room with somebody who dresses like it's 1924 for some reason with like a bowler hat and like a real dandy sign? You're like, what is this guy's, what are you doing? Like, why are you doing that? Some people decide to live that way. It's fine. This is a free country still, so you can do what you want. Mm-hmm. But I don't think the fact that some people like vinyl sort of blows up my thesis about millennials being generally unconcerned with the pace and scope of technological change. I do think that vinyl is a better experience. I think that if I may just say the name of someone who's been in the news lately, I once heard Neil Young describe, and I don't really know how much I don't know whether he was right or not, but something about the way the sound waves come out of a analog record player, analog speakers. People always say, well, it sounds richer to me, but it's because there's actual physical sound waves, multiple ones, kind of coming through the air and bombarding your eardrums all at once. Whereas with a digital signal, it's all packaged into one single wave. It's very clear. There's no static or dust or whatever in it, but it's just one wave. And so that's why people say it feels like a richer experience, like a wave is washing over them rather than this crystal sort of thing going in their eardrum. I would love to get a lot of comments and emails telling me that is wrong or helping me to better understand sound waves. But that's what I learned from Neil Young before he got famous.
Right. Well, that's great. So, Matt, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk today. Again, if you could hold up your book, if you still have your book there, you can hold it up. It's 0 Hour for Gen X.
I'll hold up the hardcover version.
Or the hardcover version. That's the version I used on the thumbnail photo for this. As we sit here talking about our digital technologies, be sure to order a physical copy of that book today. And again, thank you very much. And I will talk to you again in the not too distant future, I'm sure, Matt. It's good to be able to stay in touch with you, even though we don't sit next to each other at work anymore.
Yeah, it's good to see you, Aaron.
Right.
Thanks for talking.